Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today on behavioral supports in schools for children and youth with special healthcare needs, hosted by the Rochester Regional Support Center. We're happy that you could join us. Before we begin, we just want to share a couple of points on webinar etiquette. So to reduce background noise and distractions for today, we've muted and turned off the video for all participants. If you do have a question, please share in the Q&A section. You'll see the button at the bottom of your screen. And we do have time set aside today at the end to answer questions. And this event is being recorded, and we will share a feedback survey link in the chat. So we greatly appreciate any feedback that you're willing to provide. To enable closed captioning, please locate the icon at the bottom of your screen. So I will hand it off to Sabrina to introduce our panelists today. Thank you.
Thank you, Kylie. Next slide, please. Today, we have three wonderful panelists that will join us today to talk to you about behavioral supports in schools. And we know that this is really a topic that's been on the mind of many parents and professionals throughout the state of New York. We have Megan McGee from our educational consultation, our community consultation program. She's an educational consultant, and has been doing this work for over 20 years, working with the IDD population. Thank you so much, Meg, for being here today, and welcome. We have Jennifer Cardinale. She's the Director of Elementary Special Education at Rush Henrietta. Thank you so much, Jen, for accepting our invitation. And we have Sabrina Moore Talbot, Family Specialist for the Rochester Regional Support Center for Children and Youth with Special Healthcare Needs. We are excited to hear from each and every one of these panelists. We're going to allow them to do their own introductions. Thank you all so much. Meg, we look to hear from you first. You can kick off our panel. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me to be here today. And I think I've crossed over. I'm closer to 30 years than 20 years now. And it's a pleasure to be here. I have some goals for my 15 minutes. Really just want to talk, this type of talk necessitates some generalizations and less specificity, recognizing that each student comes with highly individualized needs that would really inform specifics of recommendations for this topic. So we're going to keep it broad. One of the cores is that collaboration is pivotal to any behavioral or educational effort in schools. We want to talk about what is function-based thinking and to promote it early on in our work with students. We want to look at practical strategies that could really minimize the presentation of any challenging behavior, as well as understanding that behavior change really comes with instruction of new behavior, not just behavior reduction. And there's a breadth of categories of training that I think are really relevant to this process for the students, the staff, and the families. A little bit about me is I am a community person. That entire time of my career, hinging on 30 years, I have been a music therapist, a preschool teacher, an autism specialist, a behavior analyst. I am currently a PhD student in human development, and I consider myself a lifelong learner, and that the students that I have the privilege to work with are really my best instructors. So I have spent my career on the road, logging miles with a car office, just traveling all over New York State and Vermont. So just to give some context and orientation to some of this information that we're going to talk about, while the lensing is applied behavior analysis, which is in a simple definition, the study of human behavior, I bring all of those previous identities to the table every time I meet a child or I get the opportunity to work with a team or a family. And some foundational principles that I bring to these efforts are that the work that we do to support students with challenging behavior or behavioral needs in schools is first and foremost is that any effort that we do is to benefit others. And that might be the individual student themselves, the teams that are supporting them, or the families that love and care for them all the time. The other is to treat others with compassion, dignity, and respect, regardless of the content of things that we need to discuss. Kindness and humility go a long way in positive teaming. To behave with integrity, and I'm going to add accountability as a member of a team, and then also to ensure competence. One would think that after a decade or 2 or 3 in the field that you know it all, and that is clearly not the case in our field, and that we are obligated and happily commit to the ongoing competence and development of our skills. When we look at the information that drives behavioral recommendations in schools, it's really a 3-pronged approach. And the first is the best available research evidence, or we call those evidence-based practices. The other is the summation of that information with all the variables that are going on, and the practitioner applying their clinical judgment. But pivotal to that is the very individualized nature of the patient's circumstances and what the family wants, values, and needs, as well as what the individual wants, values, and needs in the support that is being provided to them. I chose to bring collaborative teaming to the core of my presentation because collaboration, the value of it, and the needs for it have only increased over time. If we look back at a book published in 2012, edited by Tristram Smith, he defined collaborative teaming as a group of educators organized to implement interventions for students or sets of students with a clearly defined role for each member of the team and a structure for shared decision-making. As we move towards 2024, we are faced with a different construct of collaboration that is much larger, far more diverse, and all equally relevant in this behavioral support of children with special health needs. So now we're talking about our school-based professionals, our partnerships with families, as well as any of the home and community providers that are supporting that family as well. As much as we can all get on the same page and really keep the student or the child in focus of all of our work, the better all of our efforts will be. When we talk about collaborative teaming, there is research and evidence to support a sort of tiered approach to teaming and collaboration. At the very foundational and pivotal relationship in school settings is the parent-teacher relationship. Then we have a relationship between the teacher and their support staff in that classroom. Then we have the whole classroom team is what I call it, when we have all related services providers. I neglected to add administration onto that list. And then when I speak of comprehensive, I mean the entire wraparound system. I wanted to share this definition of applied behavioral analysis because it sets the context for the behavioral work in schools. In that, what we're really trying to do is improve the experience of the student in a manner that is socially significant to them and meaningful to them, and hopefully be able to demonstrate that what has worked and made those things work are the cause for that behavior change. So we want to eliminate guesswork and really understand what interventions are working for a student and what interventions are not, so that we dedicate our resources, our training, and support to those things that are working. Applied behavior analysis provides us a framework in which to do this. So if we think about behavior being here, we know that behavior is what the person does, the act that they engage in. We know that antecedents are those things in the environment that happen right before the occurrence of that behavior. And we know that consequences are the things that happen right after the occurrence of that behavior. We also have this area over here that's called establishing operations in current literature. Historically, that's been referred to as setting events. But these are the things in the environment that might influence the effectiveness of some of the work that we're doing in that environment, but not be directly related to the environment. So let me share with you an example for that. So I'm going to go back one. look at this, these are things that we want to take a look at. We want to offer support and maybe have a separate mechanism that supports behavior change. So for example, if I want to look at preventative measures for challenging behavior, and I'm looking at this item called establishing operations, these are things that can really influence the effectiveness of intervention and reinforcement in the educational environment. So first and foremost, I am a proponent of relationship development. We want children and students to understand that we are there as a supporting, trusting individual who really is invested in their success and they're having positive experiences in the educational environment. As a part of that effort, we want to give the students active voice in decision-making in however they may participate. A big part of that is assuring choice throughout any behavioral intervention, but also throughout the course of their school day. And also pivotal to sort of preventing challenges with behavior is we want to make sure that everybody is well informed and trained. And that might include an understanding on a specific disability, how that disability in and of itself may impact a school experience for a student, and what we might need to do to modify the environment to lessen that. We also want to talk about behavior, what it is not, and also evidence-based practices, as well as practices with observation, monitoring, and evaluation. As they say, if it's not documented, it didn't necessarily happen. But really what we use those for is so that we do pour our resources into things that are working. Other pieces that we want to look at are health and presentation. So I'm a big proponent of the eat, sleep, poop question, right? If you're eating well, sleeping well, and voiding well, then you're less likely to be experiencing any sort of discomfort or discomfort that would sort of be related to any behavioral concern or need that you have. We also want to take a look at co-occurring disorders and their interactions with each other. We want general health. Are kids doing okay? Dental visits, well-child visits, as well as specialty visits, such as with our own developmental and behavioral pediatricians. And also, if medication is a part of our behavioral work at schools, we just want to have an understanding of what that medication is, what its intention is, how we can help with determining the best timing, dosages, and those things. And again, all of that is related in collaboration. So if we look back at this, we're going to go on to antecedents, right? So these are things that we can do to modify the environment that is the intention of preventing any sort of behavioral challenge or need. So key and first and foremost is communication support. Giving children a way to communicate their wants, needs, desires, and states, whether that's emotional state or physical health. We know that visually mediated information can be far more effective than vocal delivered information, and that can take multiple forms in pictures, icons, objects even. We also want to make sure that we have interventions in that preventative area around self-regulation or co-regulation strategies, as well as modified tasks or accommodated tasks. These are really large categories of intervention, but the intention of antecedent-based intervention is to minimize the need for demonstration of any challenge because we have predicted, accommodated for it, and provided the appropriate supports. Additionally, some of these interventions could fall into the concept of executive function support that help with organization, prediction, inhibition, and perspective. Now, those are pretty big, heavy lifts. Those are some that I still struggle with on certain days. So we want to make sure the appropriate instruction and support methodologies are attached to each of these. I think this is getting better. in terms of understanding that behavior change is not necessarily rooted or effective if all we're concerned about is reducing challenging behavior. What we really want to look at is how do we promote the occurrence of adaptive, functional, meaningful behaviors for that student. We are teaching skills that will replace the efficacy or intention of some of that challenging behavior. This sounds easy, but it can sometimes require a great deal of planning and opportunity so that students have a rich enough teaching experience so that they can use those skills over and over and over again in that environment until they become acquired and utilized functionally without support. One of the things when we talk about behavior supports is really promoting this idea of understanding not just what a student does, but really function-based thinking gets to the point of why the person is doing what they are doing, right? It's a systematic way about thinking. Notice that this is not documentation. This is not a functional behavior assessment, as you see in the New York State regulations. This is a way of creating a culture that does not necessarily just react to what occurs behaviorally, but really is investing in understanding why things are happening. And what that can do is really in the early stages of behavioral challenges, shift the perspective, right? So it's more of an investigative super sleuth sort of approach, is just sort of looking at everything with this idea of why is this happening for this youngster or this young adult. So just as a quick review, these are the functions of behavior that we encounter, not just in schools, but as humans. And they are attention, so doing something to socially interact with somebody, a tangible, engaging in something because I have a desire for a thing, sensory or automatic, and then also I'm doing this because maybe I want to escape or avoid. One of the realities that we are facing now in schools is that we are facing more often than not multiply maintained or multiple function behaviors or synthesized behaviors or synthesized function of behavior. And that is that a challenging behavior is maintained by one or more of those functions that we just identified. And they tend to be a little bit trickier to address, but that's why we have teaming and collaboration. So we get full team interdisciplinary perspective on things. So for example, a student may engage in self-injurious behavior as an effort to escape whatever task is before them, but it's not just to escape, it's because they want to escape to a higher, richer, denser, more meaningful level of attention from the teacher. So that's just one example. When we think about behavioral supports in schools, reinforcement is a key to behavior change and the development of new functional and adaptive behavior. But if we do not understand the function of behavior, we can mistakenly reinforce behaviors that we do not want to see. For example, a common response in schools for severe behavior is expulsion. If a child's function of behavior is escape and we expel them, we may make it much harder to reintegrate that student back into the environment because their desire is really not to be there. So we want to be sure that our understanding of function is pervasive across the team, as well as administrators, families, and providers. Because of the time of year that we're in right now, I just wanted to have a slide that talks about transition. And this is transition for students and families because we all acclimate to certain forms of communication, habits of interaction with teachers and teams, schedules, the language associated with particular classrooms. So when we go to change environments, it can be stressful, right? So that stress then becomes an establishing operation. It may necessitate like that we put back into place higher levels of supports that had been faded over time, say in the previous academic year, because of the consistency of routines and expectations. When we shift those on a student, merely by bringing them to a new classroom context, we're going to want to be proactive with how things are the same, how things are different, and are there things that we can do to proactively expose, visit, pre-teach for students who will be entering a new environment? So examples of that might be, I have working with some phenomenal teachers right now where they have video tours of their classrooms, video tours of the complete school, or at least those areas of the school that are most relevant to the student. They will do social stories, just send picture books as just sort of an exposure to what these things look like before they land there. It may be helpful for a team and a family to sort of anticipate a little bit of regression with that change. Again, not for all students, but we might see, because of that stress or because of the lack of familiarity, not as proficient social behavior or classroom behavior as we saw at the end of the previous school year. And also key to that is identifying the student's quote unquote person, right? That might be the teacher, but it also might be the speech and language pathologist, or it might be the secretary in the main office, somebody that they really identify with and connect with. Hopefully it's somebody, really proximal to their entire program, but just knowing that these relationships in schools don't necessarily have to follow a classroom hierarchy. Other accommodations regarding transition might be to start new experiences with a higher ratio of preferred activities, and very carefully and systematically introduce the sort of teaching demands or social demands for that student in a very specific, individualized way. So here are some examples of interventions within that establishing operations ABC context. So for example, if I was concerned about fatigue or relative discomfort or illness, we would have a conversation around those things with families, saying, how is your sleep routine at home? Billy seems to be arriving at school really fatigued, and when he's fatigued, his tolerance for certain demands is diminished. There could be the necessity of a medical evaluation for constipation, or we may just have the general old like cold or flu that can really impact a kid. Examples of specific interventions at the antecedent level would be visual schedules, your communication systems, transition warnings, and routines and rituals. So important. And then when we're looking at new behaviors to teach, we want to make sure that they are serving the function of the challenging behavior, or that they are sensitive to a new approach of instruction or reinforcement. We want to teach those skills that are going to be most beneficial and pivotal to the individual in the environment if they do not exist. Okay, so things like communication, self-regulation, advocacy for self, those sorts of things. And then the consequences we might see is the reinforcement of positive behaviors, the reinforcement of new skills as they are being learned, and also function-informed responses. We want to be able to reinforce those as well. Key considerations for all of these things around behavior is that consistency is our best friend. For when we are consistent, we can evaluate with greater integrity. and we evaluate through the monitoring, right? And positive, nurturing, caring relationships is at the core of all of this. And that's not just student relationship, that's sort of the whole foundation for all relationships surrounding this. So it's the way that we interact with one another as professionals and families and internal providers and external providers as well. The form of behavior needs to be determined so that everybody can decide whether something is happening or not happening. And when I mean form of behavior is the description of the behavior, the what. And it helps us identify how we need to modify that environment. And ABC data collection is a way to determine function, but it is not necessarily the way that you want to do ongoing behavior monitoring. It's important to recognize that in a classroom or even within a family, you can have two students engaging in the same form of behavior, but the function it serves for those individuals could be different. We want to lift our children up by teaching them skills and empower them at every phase of support so that where they can identify their wants, needs, and desires, whether it be within the type of support that they receive. I had a student just say to me, Miss Meg, is there a way that we can put this on my phone and not have it be something I carry around? That was a pretty significant ask, right? It was great. Humility, professional humility, and cultural humility, excuse me, are at the core of all of this too, as collaboration is key. And I have found great benefit in anticipating potential needs versus reacting to needs as they arise. So thank you. The idea here is that I will now turn it over to my friend and colleague, Jennifer Cardinelli, and she is going to talk about what these things look like in the context of school.
Thank you, Meg. Share my screen. All right, so we're going to talk about behavioral supports in schools for students with special needs. A little bit about me. My main job is coordinator of special education in Rush Henrietta. I have primary focus on students preschool through grade 3. So I get them transitioning from early intervention or just at home with their parents when they're around 3 years old. And I support them through preschool services, then transition them into kindergarten. And then in Rush Henrietta, we transition them into 4th grade at our intermediate school. So lots of transitions as they grow. I also work at the University of Rochester as an adjunct professor in the early childhood program, which has been really fun to teach because it's my passion and what I do daily and get to inspire future leaders coming in. So that's really fun. And then again, my email is here if you guys have any follow-up questions. All right, so really starting to think about having that common understanding of what is special needs. So it really is a student who has a disabling condition, either physically, developmentally, behaviorally, or emotionally. So it can be a broad spectrum. And when we think about behavior, and we know it's a form of communication, we are going to see it from all disabilities, right? It's not coined into one zone. It's going to happen across the spectrum. There are 2 different disabilities that we look at in school. There is the DSM-5 medical disabilities. So that's going to come from your doctor, from a clinician, and then it's going to translate in school potentially into a educational classification. So when we think about behavior, I'm going to coin it behavior, medical diagnoses that are coming out are ADHD, anxiety, autism spectrum disorder, emotional behavior disorders, your ODDs, and those types of more behavioral disorders. In school, we may look to see, okay, you have this diagnosis, but what does it look like in school? We have to triangulate the data. You have the diagnosis, Now we have to look for those scores, and then we have to look at overall behavior. What does it look like? Is it an other health impairment? Does it limit that alertness? Is it a emotional disability? Is it just you're so flooded with feelings and you react and you don't have control about it? That's that emotional disability. Is it the classification of autism? So diagnosis of medical autism doesn't always translate into the educational classification of autism. They are kind of train tracks, they parallel each other, but they can sometimes mirror each other. We'll find a connection there. And then again, there are 13 category classifications. So there are many others: speech and language impairment, learning impairment, and many more. But overall, these are going to be kind of your behavioral categories that we may see. So we're going to talk a little bit more about what does that mean. Two big things we want to think about is equality and equity. Two great words in education right now. We want to provide supports in the least restrictive environment, and we want to make sure students have access to everything they can. So when you think of equality, that's making sure that equal access to all. But does that really include all students? And so that's where equity comes in. So if you look at it in the first part, everybody has the same bike, but is everybody the same? No, one friend can't even get on the bike, right? Other friends are too big, too small, and then there's a just right. So if you look at equality, you have to figure out everybody needs a bike, but that bike doesn't have to be the same. It's going to look a little different, but it's going to go in the same direction. We're going to get to the same end point, but how we get there is going to be slightly different. And that's key. You don't want to give someone too much support, but if you give them too little, it's not going to be enough. So you have to find the right fix. So this visual, I have it in my office. I love it. And it reminds me of finding the right fit, not too much, but not too little. And it's going to change, right? As we change, our bike size is going to change. You're going to go from a 12-inch to a 14-inch to a 21-inch. But everybody's going to have a bike. You're all going to get there. And so just be mindful as we're thinking about supports. What is it that they need right now? And as you know, we're constantly going to be progress monitoring and reviewing to see, is this still the right fit? Do they need more? Do they need less? So when you think about school systems, we have two approaches. You have your proactive approach and you have your reactive approach. So two things that should be naturally in schools by New York State law right now is PBIS, positive behavioral intervention and supports, as well as response to intervention. These are two systems that are tiered to support all students. That's your tier one. So what's happening in your building that's building culture, that's building acceptance, that's building positivity, that's supporting students, making them feel welcomed and accepted. That's your PBIS. And there's going to be levels of supports. So tier one is for all students. What are you doing for all students? Okay, some students, we're starting to see some behavior. What are we doing for those students? That's going to be some of our students, right? You may have a check-in, check-out system. You may have a communication form that's going home between school and parents. So not all students need that, but some of your students need that. And then you're going to have your tier three behavioral supports that are for small students. And we're going to talk a little bit more about maybe that is a functional behavioral assessment. How do we find that function that Meg was talking about to say, okay, this is why it's happening, and now this is what we're going to do about it. And again, response to intervention, because kind of chicken or egg, is it the academics that are causing the behaviors? Is it the behaviors that's causing the academics? And so you have to have both of these systems solidly in place and implemented with fidelity to support students proactively. And then reactively, if the PBIS and RTI are still not working and we need to give more support, we can look at, does the student qualify for an IEP, individual education program, or do they qualify for a Section 504 plan? So let's talk a little bit about what are these two plans, because that question is still coming up a lot. Is it an IEP? Is it a 504? Are they eligible? Is it just given to them? What is it? So when we look at an IEP, that does fall under IDA, federal regulation. It's very narrow. Students have to qualify for one of those 13 classifications. So they may have a medical diagnosis, but does that translate into a classification? That's what we have to dive into and unpack. What does an IEP do? It really provides specially designed instructions to students that have those deficits and related services to meet their unique needs. It has goals. It has an opportunity to progress monitor. That's the big thing about an IEP. When we talk about 504, it does not have goals. So an IEP will progress monitor what we're doing. Is it working? Do we need to adjust? It is reviewed every year, and a reevaluation is required at least once every 3 years. So 504, same type of plan. It's going to provide supports. It's under a different regulation. It's under Section 504. It has a broad disability. This is where your medical diagnoses come into play with 504. So if a doctor says, oh, they have ADHD, and we're seeing that impact school and they just need accommodations, that's when we can look at a 504. There are no program and services related to a 504. There's no goals. There's really no progress monitoring. It's recommended to review yearly, but it does, if everything's going well, you don't have to review it that year. Let's roll it over and see how next year goes. And a reevaluation is required periodically. So it's not as well defined, but it will provide accommodations and supports based on that medical disability and the presentation of it in the school setting. How do we go about seeking this support? So if we feel that our tier 1, tier 2 supports are not enough, if we have data and a student is still really struggling in the school, we can look at a referral to special education. Both plans are going to come through the Office of Special Education. It's primarily a parent or school personnel that writes the letter to either the building principal or the Office of Special Education, and they say, my son, my daughter is really struggling. This is what's happening. This is what I want to look at. And then I want a meeting, basically. So you're going to get the referral. We're going to do a bunch of evaluations that we're going to talk about in a minute. Then once the evaluations are completed, we have 60 days to complete the evaluations. We have a stakeholder meeting, and that's to determine eligibility. Do they qualify for one of the 13 classifications, or is it supported through a 504 plan? If it's yes to either of those, the plans are implemented and then they are reviewed. When we think about assessments, so we have to have school-based data to support that eligibility. And that's really key. It's not just a single factor that's going to lead us to those school-based supports through an IEP or 504. Because remember, we still have PBIS and RTI that can happen for all students without any regulation. Those should naturally be happening, and we can't lose sight of those. But when we look at assessments, we really want to dive deep into the social history. So Meg talked a lot about what's happening. Are they eating? Are they sleeping? Are they pooping, right? What is happening at home? Tell me about your parents. All of those good pieces. We're going to look at the psychoeducational evaluations. How is their brain functioning? What is their true ability compared to their performance? We are going to gather a ton of information on their social emotional rating scales. So we're going to look at the Connors and the VASC and figure out where are they falling on anxiety, depression, hyperactivity. We're going to gather as much information. And if there's a socially significant behavior that's truly impacting their ability to perform at school, and it's key, when I say perform, it's not just academics. We also have to look at the whole child. So we could have the brightest child out there, IQ of 132, but they're not coming to school, or they're coming to school and they're not completing any work. We have to figure out what's going on. What is the function of that behavior that's impeding their performance? So an FBA is critical for those socially significant behaviors to figure out the function. We're going to do observations, and then we're going to look at those classroom performance tasks. And we're going to put all of that together And we really have to take it all in. We have to make this big puzzle to say, okay, what's happening here? Is there an educational disability? And how do we best support this student? When you're thinking about classroom supports or school supports, we really want to think about, okay, what is our environment looking like? What does it need to look like? What materials do we have? What materials do we need? So again, Meg talked about visual schedules and timers and all of those good pieces. We have to think what works, what's working at home, what's working in the community, what's working at school, and then human resources. And I know everybody jumps to aid support when we think of behavior, which is great, but sometimes we're creating dependent learners. And so we have to make sure that we are encouraging, we call it the productive struggle, right? It's helping kids overcome some of those, but supporting them, giving them that hurdle help. But it's not so much just the aid, but what is that adult going to do? What do they need to say? What do they need to show? Where do they need to fade? And where do they need to prompt? So it's really important we think about all of those resources. So again, coming in, observing, talking with our colleagues. What does the classroom look like, sound like? Is there adaptive equipment? Sensory is a big play with a lot of behaviors. Is it too loud? Is it too dark? Is it too light? What does it smell like, right? Looking at all of those factors. Peer support. Are there positive peers that the student is around? Are there peers that are triggering the student? Social skills training. So we talk a lot about at school is we support kids through crisis. We support kids through transitions, but are we teaching the skill deficit? And that's a big thing that we've been really pushing is how are we teaching them those replacement behaviors? What do we want the student to do instead of kicking, hitting, screaming, spitting, running, right? If we're just constantly responding to the behavior, where are they going to learn that replacement behavior? So we need to make sure that we have teaching practices in place, whether that's community support or school support, but how are we teaching the students the skills that we want them to know and do so that when they are overwhelmed or when they are frustrated, then they can use those skills. Positive reinforcement, that is huge. And we have to make sure we are reinforcing the right behaviors because often in schools and just naturally, we are reinforcing some of the negative behaviors because it's quick and easy. It's that easy fix versus really prompting first this, then that. Visual supports are key, assistive technology, modeling, the behavior intervention plan. So this tags with the FBA. So a lot of people pair FBA and behavior intervention plan together, but they are two separate documents. The FBA is the assessment, helping us find the function of the behavior. Sometimes students qualify for a behavior intervention plan based on the intensity, the frequency of the behavior. But some students do not qualify for a behavior intervention plan. So the FBA will predict if a behavior intervention plan is warranted, but they are two separate documents, and it's really important to understand what is the purpose of each document and how do we use them in schools. Counseling is a great opportunity. We have school-based counseling. UMRC is partnering with many schools. So we also have some clinics. I know we have clinics in Rush Henrietta, which have been great to provide more trauma-informed counseling right in school. And it's pairing nicely with our school-based counseling. We have consultation. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but consultation is key because everybody knows what they know and they all have a unique specialty. And so we really need to come together. If we want to support a child at home, in the community, at school, we really need to come together and say, this is what I know, this is what I can help with, and this is how, and this is why. So it's really important that we are consulting with everybody. Skilled nursing, because that medical piece, we really want to get our nurses involved, whether they're at the pediatrician's office or at our school office or wherever. And then the other big piece that is coming more and more is parent training and counseling. We need to get our parents involved because they are doing some great things at home. that we need to be doing at school, and we're doing some great things at school that we need them to do at home. The more we can partner together and be on the same page, and kids understand, oh, it's not different rules at different places, we will move behavior in the right direction for the right reason. So when I talk about collaborative teamwork, I can't talk as I would love to talk about this so much more, but the more we can truly collaborate, be on the same page, work together. We are all here for this one student. And I mean teachers, parents, providers, students, get the students involved. The more we do with them instead of to them or for them, the faster they're going to move in the direction that we need to get them in. They're going to feel supported, they're going to feel part of it, and they're going to want what we can offer. Extended family members can be helpful, neighbors and friends. So it does take a village to raise a child. And I always tell people, call them up, get them here. Let's figure out how we can help each other versus finger pointing or blaming. It doesn't help. It doesn't go anywhere. So really rallying the troops and helping everybody understand the purpose and the goal. And then lastly, this is a hot topic in education, but removals and suspensions. So yes, a student may have a disability, may not have a disability. There still is a code of conduct that the schools have to uphold. And so we have to balance what's happening and why, right? So my guidance to administrators in my district is health and safety. You know, if someone is getting hurt to a point that they need to seek medical attention, that's where we have to say we need a pause, right? We need a pause and we need to figure out the plan. So we need to understand who the student is, why it's happening, and then how do we correct it? But this is a big hot topic nationwide. That there's so much research around right now. It's a passion of mine, finding alternatives to suspension. But most importantly, why do we send kids home when they have behavioral challenges? And a lot of times it is a pause. It's a pause for maybe the classroom teacher got hurt and she's out for the day. Paraprofessional was hurt. That's the one-on-one aid. Another student was hurt. And we need to pause for a time to figure out how are we going to teach and support the student when they return? How are we going to do a circle in the classroom to get everybody back to baseline and feel supported? So there is that grace period that we have to work with everybody and look at the big picture, and it's hard. But there are also parameters. So big thing is manifestation. And again, looking at what is the student, why are they doing this, and how are we supporting them? So most importantly, you know, remembering that not every child with a disability does qualify for an IEP or 504. Make sure we're really focusing on those PBIS components and those RTI components, but looking at eligibility is a key component. Show yourself and everybody around you compassion as we are supporting some of our most struggling students. We are all trying. We all want what's best for our friends. Advocate, but be kind and give grace. That's really key right now. The more we truly can work together in a positive fashion, the better it is going to be for everybody involved. Questions, ask questions. You know, don't assume, don't try to understand what you don't understand, but really ask questions, ask for those clarifications, collaborate, and really celebrate those small wins along the way to keep everybody motivated and in the right direction. And then I did link just two resources from New York State. It's the Parents Guide to Special Education, as well as the Rights of Parents with Children. So those are two great resources to help in schools, and I'm happy to answer any questions at the end. All right, Sabrina, tag, you are it.
All right. So hello, everyone. I'm Sabrina Moore Talbot. I work at the UR Medical Center in Developmental and Behavioral Pediatrics. More specifically, you know, I work as a project health specialist, and right now I'm currently working on a Department of Health grant that is supporting children and youth with special health care needs. I've spent, gosh, 25 years, I guess, with URMC in various roles, really centered around early childhood, youth development, disability, community outreach, and engagement. So I've always been community focused and, really wanting to work with just families and just underserved communities. And, SHIN, or children and youth with special health care needs, falls right, in my sweet spot for work. But I wanted to talk a little bit about my experience as a parent of two children with developmental disabilities. So I have currently, and it's a very interesting, nerve-wracking time because they're 18 and 17 years old respectively. So they're on the end of, that whole school sort of experience. And I was just going through a lot of different things with them. But my oldest son, who's 18, is actually in a program through Project Life. So he's actually getting some work experience and loving it. But he does have a significant learning delay. And then my second son, who I'm really focusing on for purposes of this presentation today, he has autism. And so I wanted to just kind of talk like as a parent going through like the different levels, with school, just the reality of, knowing that my son or sons required early intervention supports and would need them, throughout their academic life. It was really, it was really something to go through that experience with them. And so, the big thing with Ashton, both my kids had early intervention, and he didn't do a lot of talking. And I can remember that the specialty teachers, in his preschool, really talked about his lack of interaction, I guess, with other kids. He did a lot of parallel stuff. He worked solo. He didn't do a whole lot of, talking. And, they suggested that, he needed some services, that maybe he might, need an evaluation, but that something was happening. So they were mentally, preparing me for, the needs that would come after. And my oldest son was already kind of like in early intervention and receiving OT, speech, PT. So he was getting all of that. So, I did have like a year or so under my belt of, or a couple of years rather, with him, knowing the kinds of services at that age, what would be available. But, it was really, I guess I was really not in a place to accept it yet. I was like, well, he's still young, for some of the families, if there's parents there, you say, oh, he's still young, let's see what he's going to do. Let's not put labels on him and, start classifying and doing all that kind of stuff, because that's what we do, but we do it in an effort to try to, help really. And so, but I was, really kind of reluctant, about things. And so when Ashton, shifted into like intermediate school. So like his years, like third grade through sixth grade, I was at U of R and I was learning about all this great stuff around, disability, learning about the IEPs, how they were structured up. Of course, I started, my career of attending those meetings and, meeting with the specialists and the teachers to kind of talk about plans for him. So I was getting immersed with that, but feeling, as a parent, overwhelmed. There's all that technical language that comes with IEPs and other sorts of interventions that they could be talking about or that were on paper for me to review. And I was very grateful to have support in the workplace and colleagues that knew all about this stuff and, would remind me that I had the keys to the car. They would say, Sabrina, you've got the keys to the car with your kids around their needs. So don't be afraid to ask. And, here's some things that you might want to think about. And I know my son got evaluated a little later for his autism diagnosis. So he was maybe around 10 or so that, you know, I took him to Strong and he received that diagnosis. And then, you know, the acceptance of things, there were things I had to accept. He was also encountering some challenges with the material. You know, they say by the time a kid gets to 3rd grade, there's certain things that they need to have some mastery on once they start shifting into the upper grades, because then it's all about, you know, curriculum and scaffolding learning. And so for Ashton, there were things that just weren't, you know, weren't clicking, you know, not talking, not, you know, understanding some pieces, things taking a lot of time to process, and particularly for the social part. So like his English and reading and things like that, you know, the teachers were seeing that there were some issues, and they were trying different things, you know. And so I really went out for the diagnosis to get that, because I knew about autism, you know, working at Strong and just developmental disabilities. So I could see some things and what some benefits would be for him, you know, in school and what he could get. So, you know, I just started asking questions. And so these are the things, I guess, that I would impart to families, you know, when you're in IEPs or even parent teacher conferences. Those are wonderful places to ask those questions around behavioral supports and things, and to look at the actual environment in the classrooms as well, to, you know, see if they're hitting marks for your child. And so for Ashton, for my son, he was more of not so physical behaviors that you would see that that I think teachers and schools would, you know, have you know, interventions or things to respond to. His thing was more, he was quiet. He was like the kid in the classroom that didn't say much, you know, and you'd have to go and check on him. He would almost become like invisible. And so I worried about an inclusive environment for him, and whether or not teachers and paras were, you know, engaging him, you know, because I know that, you know, teachers have their curriculum and their things that they have to get through, right? They got to get through their program. And so they're moving at a particular pace. And so they're always concerned when you know, a kiddo can't keep pace with things. And so I started asking questions about, you know, how is he doing? You know, asking questions, you know, like, is he asking you questions? You know, if he's in trouble, you know, something he doesn't understand, is he raising his hand? You know, or I would ask the teachers, you know, what's your strategies for working with your kids that are shy, quiet, or they have a diagnosis? I know for Ashton in intermediate school, it was the toughest. That's when he got his diagnosis. The teachers at that time, they really didn't have the background like on autism. They really didn't know, you know, much about it. And so I was in a mode where I was teaching, you know, I was sharing information, I was sharing links to resources, you know, for them, and, you know, saying, hey, I am not just, you know, pulling stuff out of thin air. You know, there's some best practice here around using certain techniques or using certain visuals, like you've heard today about, you know, visuals and having schedules and routines for kids, and particularly for those with autism, having a routine. I know my son, his routine is golden, and if it's altered in any way, he does have like a reaction. It makes him a bit uncomfortable. But, you know, I started, you know, asking questions. The other thing too for me and working with the schools is that my husband was always with me for meetings. We did not miss IEP meetings, and we didn't miss teacher conferences. We were always there together. And it was very, I think, useful for the teachers and leadership to see that, that we cared, that we had questions, And that we were welcoming ideas, and we certainly were. It's like we didn't go in, like we were authorities on by any means, but we certainly wanted to, bring everybody into the fold, because it does take a village to really, make positive change, for your kids, and that they're having a good school experience. And I wanted so much, so much for my boys to have a good experience. And, for Ashton, he was still sort of like integrated in regular classroom. Whereas, my other son was in a 12-1-1. So I was seeing just like a lot of different, you know, experiences for them, like how certain things were handled, and, things that they miss out on by being in, structured classrooms, that integration and interaction, which could be beneficial, you can miss out on it. And on top of, if you have a son that doesn't do a whole lot of socializing, because he's concerned about how he communicates, and things like that. So, in intermediate, when he got his diagnosis, he did get some RTI supports. But the diagnosis, I didn't feel, that the schools really recognized that as much as I was hoping, like at that level. But by the time he got to middle school, things opened up. So a lot of the tools that we've talked about today, they were certainly in play by middle school. So, Ashton had a nice routine. He knew what he was going to, be doing, and what he needed to do. There were challenges for him around advocating for himself. And that still remains a weak point for him. Although we did put in a lot of work, myself and the teaching team, at the middle school level and at the high school. And I'm going to get to the high school, but that the middle school level, they were really kind of grooming him to get acclimated for like the higher grades. And, that was really good. But I did try to work with the schools on the social aspect. And that's one of the things that I wish that there had been more of, PBIS kinds of interventions kind of in place, because my kids, they're like 17, 18. So I know that there's lots of things that have been happening now that wasn't there for us. But I wanted my son to have friends and to socialize more. And it's just so hard. And then being in U of R, working there, and also being a graduate student, a graduate of the Human Development Program, to just learning about, autism and friendships and things. And that's a very, very important part of school life for kids. And when they usher into that youth, those older grades, friendships and identity and, those things come to the forefront and become really important. But, middle school was definitely better. And I made a point of not missing meetings, also being schooled on IEPs and then later 504s was important, so that I wasn't intimidated by those plans. When I ran into any issues with teachers, because I will say that did come up, and I think it did because teachers, they go to school and they learn, how to teach in a particular way. Some, they don't have a specialty, in working with kids with autism. They're in a classroom with kids with varying abilities, interests, and they've got to control that classroom and work that classroom, and they've got to meet their targets for the learning. And so, there were times where I met with resistance, and it was hard. It could be frustrating. But I also found that leadership in my particular school district was really helpful. I had a good rapport with administrative leadership around my kids' IEPs and, what their needs were. And so I would use the administrative leadership sometime as a middleman with things if I just didn't feel like we were, progressing the way we needed to, that turned out to be a very helpful thing for me, and advocating for my sons and like getting supports in place and just helping to facilitate, I think, the right kind of environment between us parents and the professionals in the school that we're seeing Ashton every day, that we get in a good mind space together to kind of move forward. And so I would say to parents, don't be afraid to, reach out, to your leadership and stuff, because they knew my kids. They had their pictures, they knew them, they had the full inside story, and it helped a lot because, this is a really tough, thing to navigate, IEPs and special education and your kids' diagnosis and balancing their school life and their home life. It's a lot. And so just, moving to the high school. So I gotta say with high school, Ashton, I think he really blossomed. I think the team was great. I was just like, I'm so regretful that I didn't have more of that he didn't have more of that. But in high school, I saw his team stay intact. That was one thing with just his IEPs and supports. And just for continuity for him, he would have changes with teachers. I mean, they're going to change every year, as he moves up a grade. But, there were sometimes, things where there were teachers that came in and they transitioned out, quickly, or they would have specialists or like interns, like those that come in and they put in time to do evaluations and things like that, the yearly evaluations that are done with the kids to kind of justify, their program, make changes and things like that. So, they would change and, Ashton would get connected. And we talked a little bit about that. It's like that point person, that your kid has. And it's a big deal because he wasn't a super social kid. But when he moved to high school, he got a lot more open to try things. So performing arts, he got involved with that, which was just, I was amazed at what he was able to do, but that's because his teachers built into his, IEP plans and then listening to input from us that we wanted him to have some more social experiences. And, we said to them, hey, we know, hey, he's not going to be that person that's going to be the extrovert, that's the life of the party somewhere. That's not who he is. He's been, in the system for, 17 years. We don't think that's going to change, but he could still have interests, and we should be encouraging his confidence to pursue those things. So he was in dance performances, he was in, actual play pieces. And we were just amazed. It's like, this is another side of him we don't see. He's doing one thing in school, and when he comes home, he's a totally different person. And so when we go to the school context, and that's why we loved it, my husband and I, so much with those of us that we got a chance to see him in a different way. And so he got more involved that way. The other thing that has been great, and it's also been mentioned here about transition and how schools handle, transitions, for kids. And the team that he's had has been great with that in terms of resources, just a lot more versed in, what's out there and available, and, providing, links, guidance, videos, things on guardianship, you name it. They were like really providing lots of information to us, in his high school years that they thought would be helpful to us, and they have been. The other piece is the team that he has that is just kind of supporting his curriculum, just supporting the more advocacy kinds of things for himself, like being more vocal, and, pursuing some things that'll allow him to grow as a young man. They've been steady and strong. So they've been like the same teaching group, which I think has really been helpful for him. And his social worker has just been fabulous, absolutely fabulous with helping to, him think about, his place in the world, where it could be. And the young people need to have that. So my son, so it's different. I know he's not, his behaviors, he doesn't show them. It's like they're hidden, but he still has significant needs. And we had to plan for them, accordingly. And so me and my husband just being there and asking questions, what is he doing that's interesting in the classroom? We would ask him that at home too, but sometimes we would get a different response when we were in meetings with the team to kind of ask it and to just check, hey, the things in the IEP that you said that you would provide, like the extended, time for testing, which was a huge thing for him in high school. It's like, hey, is that in play? And something interesting that came up, since I know we talked a little bit about the 504 plans. One of the things with my son with the testing, he needed lots of time and he needed things read to him, as part of his accommodations. And, he would be literally last year when he took some of his Regents exams, he was like the last kid to leave. So he used the full time, and the teachers, and I think it was more of a reactive thing. I wish it would have been more proactive, some thinking around the testing stuff, that they said, what, maybe there's some things with the 504 we need to be looking at, and Ashton needs some accommodations for, exams. And so some things have changed for him because he did qualify for a 504. So, and then I ended up learning about all of that because one of the priorities that we made it very clear to school leadership is that we wanted to see our son graduate, that he would receive a diploma. Because my oldest son was not able to do that. So he's getting a certificate. So he's completing a program, and in another couple of years, he'll, receive a certificate. But with Ashton, because he could handle the curriculum, that we wanted to see him get a diploma. So we were really working collectively as a team to make sure that that happened. So I guess, and what I would say, other things aside from just, going to your parent-teacher conferences, and asking questions and looking at, the surroundings and, things on the IEP that might be a concern, that, you just ask. Don't be afraid to ask. And I guess that's all. That's all I have. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you all so much for attending our webinar today. Such amazing information. Sabrina, thank you so much for sharing your story. So insightful. We really appreciate every one of you taking time out of your schedule today. We know that schools were kind of, schools were canceled today due to the weather and different things were happening, but this webinar provided some very much needed information to all of our families across New York State. Please do complete our survey. I have put it in the chat a couple of times. We will be sending it out to everyone along with the slides and a recording of today's webinar. Thank you to our esteemed panelists. You guys were absolutely amazing. The information you provided is so insightful and valuable to all of the work that we do to improve the lives of children and youth with special healthcare needs. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much for staying with us. We appreciate you all. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.